Yes, that's correct. So the first author is a PhD student who graduated about a year ago, and since he's not a student, I can't help him pay the way he's get here, so I'm presenting. But this was part of his dissertation. So it's about evaluating cursor offsets in selection in VR. So of course, when we're talking about VR, AR, or mixed reality, we're often talking about 3D user interfaces. And generally, that's some type of interaction in 6 degrees of freedom or more. And usually, we separate them into travel, manipulation, selection, and system control. And then within selection metaphors, there are a number of different metaphors. The grasping metaphors, where you're sort of mimicking grasping things directly. Pointing metaphors, where you're pointing at things. And then a couple other techniques that sort of add a surface to some sort of indirect approach. And sometimes we separate between bimanual and unimanual as well. So in this paper, what we present is a comparison of 4 different cursor offset techniques used over a range of both reachable and non-reachable objects distances. And we measure movement time, error rate, and effective throughput with Fitts law. And then we also do a comparison of how the offset techniques interact with what type of input is being used. One is a handheld device, and the other one is freehand 3D interaction. So the term, the virtual hand metaphor, oftentimes is just used in sort of a generic way to say you're tracking the hand or an input device, and you show a 3D model that could be a hand or just a 3D cursor. But still, sometimes it's called the virtual hand. And one main issue is how you do the mapping of the user's real hand, the pose, the location, orientation, to the virtual hand or pose. And the simplest approach, of course, is just a one-to-one mapping, but if we're all familiar that there are a lot of different ways of doing dynamic mappings. So in this case, for example, as the user reaches his arm out, the cursor basically, instead of staying co-located with his hand, it basically starts extending out into space based on some mapping function. And so this brings up into question different ways of studying the pluses and minuses of having co-located versus disjoint locations of the two, the hand and the virtual hand. And of course, that also brings up the extended reach techniques, which this is a sort of bit of a diagram of. The go-go technique basically says as your hand gets past a certain threshold, the virtual cursor starts extending out in sort of a quadratic gain factor. And then there are techniques like the Homer technique that sort of combine methods with a ray casting method for selection. And then once you've selected the object, you basically, the virtual hand jumps to the object and you're manipulating the pose more or less directly. So when it comes to the question of do cursor offsets help or hurt, there's some variations in the literature. So some early work in HMDs basically found that having no offset, so direct one-to-one mapping, produced better results in terms of selection interaction. When the go-go technique was first experimented with, they compared using the go-go technique with no offset for interaction in the sort of near space and found that there wasn't any difference. Within Fish Tank VR, there were some experiments looking at co-located versus disjoint. So they basically had a stylus, and then there was a virtual cursor, and it was either co-located or not, and they'd found relatively no difference for selection. In a cave experiment, they had no offset, 3-inch offset, and a 2-foot offset, and they actually found that the shorter offset enhanced the performance of a docking task. And then more recently, in a slightly more nuanced result, in essentially a virtual workbench environment, they found that with no offset, it resulted in a higher effective throughput, but with some offset, it actually had higher selection precision. So these were different results under slightly different display circumstances. So just to review some basics, although this audience may already probably know all this, Fitts law basically is about measuring and predicting how long it takes a movement time to select an object. So if we had a 2D case, you basically display a 2D rectangle on the screen, and that's called a target rectangle. And then that has a width. Assume it's just a square, and basically the width shows up in the equation right there. And then somewhere in the trial, the regular cursor shows up at a location, and you have your participant who is then told to move the cursor to the target as fast as they can and click the button. And this introduces the distance, which basically is how far they had to move. So generally, of course, the farther the distance, the more difficult the task, the longer it takes. The wider the target, the easier the task. And that gives you the index of difficulty, and that then works into computing the predicted motion time, which is a linear equation with index of difficulty, and the two coefficients are generally based on the particular hardware environment and display environment that you're using. And the last point to review is the idea of throughput measured in bits per second, and that's basically the average index of difficulty divided by the average motion time over all trials in an experiment. So what we actually use is a slightly more sophisticated version based on an ISO standard. So this is called the effective index of difficulty. So here the effective distance is represented by the average movement distance. The effective width is basically calculated from the variability of the actual selection positions that the user selected. So the actual calculation basically uses a standard deviation of the projection of the cursor onto the task axis during the selection itself. And essentially these adjustments allow for making the throughput less sensitive to device characteristics, and which is desirable when you're crossing comparisons between different devices. So following some folks in this room, we started with a 2D ISSO version of a multi-directional tapping task. And so just to review the way this works is you have a series of circles that are the targets. The W refers to the width of each little circle, and essentially one is highlighted in sequence, and then they are laid out on a larger circle. And so the typical sequence is you would highlight item number 1, the user selects that, then they get highlighted number 2, the user selects that, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. So you're bouncing back and forth, and so essentially the distance d in the previous equation is roughly the diameter d here of that circle. So bringing this into 3D and VR, in our environment, the user is seated wearing a stereoscopic HMD. And so that means instead of circles, we have spheres, and this again is borrowing from prior work. And essentially the spheres are basically broken up into 2 different hemicircles, so there's a separation in depth. And the reason for that is, of course, you want the user to have his hand motion not just going left and right and up and down, but also forward and back. So the color coding we use is the target is shown in blue. This little white sphere is basically the cursor, a virtual hand representation that the user is controlling. If the user correctly intersects the target and indicate to completion or confirmation of the selection, it turns green. If there's an incorrect selection, it turns red, and it won't advance to the next case until you do the correct version. So just to say a bit more detail, this monitor, of course, is just showing what the user is actually seeing in the HMD. And then the 2 device conditions we have is a handheld device, which is the relatively inexpensive but now hard to buy Razer Hydra, and then the Leap Motion. So this will just show a quick video of the user performing the task, and you see bouncing back and forth, and it turns green when he selects it correctly, and the confirmation of selection is pulling the trigger button. And in this case, there's basically 17 spheres, which counts for 16 because the first one doesn't basically get counted. And this is the same task with a Leap Motion. And so the Leap Motion here was attached to the Oculus using a standard mount that it's provided to make them work together, and the system's running in Unity with their standard drivers. Okay, so the input device is one independent variable. The second independent variable is the offset technique that we're using. So the simple equation is meant to represent the offset technique. So P hand is the position of the actual hand, P cursor is the position of the actual cursor, and the V offset is the offset vector, which can be computed in a couple ways. So the first condition is no offset, so it's a null vector for V. The second condition is a fixed length offset. It basically was fixed to about 1 meter in front of the user as a displacement. The third one was the go-go offset. So here we basically remind ourselves what these techniques look like. So the x-axis is the hand position or distance from the torso. The y-axis is the distance of the cursor. So when there's no offset, essentially it's just a straight line slope. So technically that slope should probably be 1. In the fixed offset line basically has the same slope, but it is offset vertically, which represents the 1 meter offset. And then if you recall in the go-go technique, as your hand gets past a certain threshold from your torso, this quadratic gain factor kicks in and you're sort of extending the cursor out farther into space. And then in the linear offset condition, which was number 4, we basically just use a straight linear ramp. And then we calculate the parameters for these latter 3 techniques so that when your arm reaches your physical extent, the cursor is always reaching the same virtual extent. And obviously with no offset, you can't reach as far. So this is a side view based on the picture we showed earlier. So this was the monitor sitting on the desk with a camera that's helping track the Oculus HMD. The user's head is roughly at this position, and these are the different distances that we put the circle of spheres at. So the first distance was 30 centimeters, then 50 centimeters, then 1.2 meters, and then 1.4. So these first 2 are basically reachable. The second 2 are basically beyond reach. So we had 24 participants. Average age was young, 28. We didn't actually use all 32 combinations of these 3 variables. So in the table down here, you basically see X's and check marks. So the check marks are combinations that were used. The X's are combinations that were not used. So the simplest one to understand is that for the no offset condition, we didn't bother testing people's ability to get to the 1.2 meters and 1.4 meters because the user's seated. You're not navigating and you can't reach it at all. So those aren't tested. The other one that's left out is for the fixed length offset, the offset is fixed at 1 meter. And so if you're trying to select objects that are closer than 1 meter, you'd have to get out of your seat and stand backwards. So those 2 conditions are left out as well. It was within subject's design, the order of the offset techniques was counterbalanced with Latin squares, and then again we're measuring movement time, error rate, and effective throughput. So we had 3 hypotheses. One was that in the within reach conditions, so those first 2 distances, object selection would be faster and the error rate would be lower with a no offset condition than the other 2, and that's just based on prior work. For the out of reach conditions, we actually expected the linear offset to perform better than the fixed or go-go. So better than the fixed makes sense because you're a little bit more dynamic range. Relative to the go-go, that was based on the fact that the quadratic gain factor could sort of make it easier to overshoot or undershoot. And then last, just from our developing the software and pilot testing, we expected that the Hydra would basically do better than the Leap Motion because the pinch gesture recognition seemed to be having a negative effect, increasing error rates. So we did a 3-way repeated measure ANOVA, used standard adjustments to deal with violations of sphericity, and for the post hoc pairwise comparisons, we used Fisher's least significant differences. So movement time. So I'll split these out into the within reach pairs and the out of reach pairs. So within reach pairs, the offset technique was significant. Selecting with no offset was significantly faster than the other 2. That was the average. It was about 1.8 seconds versus about 2.6. And then the device was also significant as well. In general, the Hydra had about 2 seconds, and the Elite Motion was about 2.6. And as indicated by these graphs, there were a lot of interaction effects as well. So in figure A, there was an interaction between offset and depth. At the 30 centimeter distance, there was no difference between the go-go and the linear, but when you moved a little bit farther out to the 50 centimeter, the selection with the linear was slightly faster than the go-go. And the tables in the paper have all the p-values, et cetera. For the out-of-reach conditions, then again, offset technique was significant. On average, the linear offset was faster than the other two. And again, the device on average was significant. The Razer Hydra was about 3.6 seconds, and then the Elite Motion was about 5. So the difference started getting a little bit bigger. And again, there are interaction effects. For the Razer Hydra here, go-go was faster than fixed, but for the Elite Motion, they did not significantly differ, and that basically probably had to do with the larger standard deviation, roughly speaking. And then for the last one, number C, or letter C, offset versus depth, the significant interaction occurred again, and at the 1.2 meters, selecting with a fixed offset was not significantly different than the go-go, but when you move to the farthest distance that we tested, then the fixed offset actually became faster, which was a little bit unexpected, but that's the way it worked out. All right, error rates. So again, I'll split these between discussing the within reach and the out of reach, and then an aside for the devices as well. So for error rates, the offset technique again was significant. Subjects missed fewer targets with the no offset than with the go-go and the linear offset. So there the error rates were about 15% for no offset, and then about 28 and 25 for the go-go and the linear. And overall, the linear offset was more accurate than the go-go technique. Device-wise, let's see, device-wise, there we go. The Razer Hydra was more accurate. It had a 20% error rate. The Elite Motion at this distance had 26. Walking through some of the interaction techniques, interaction effects. In figure A, yeah, that throws you off, doesn't it? Same word used too many different ways. So for the Razer Hydra, no offset was a lower error rate than the other two, but for the Elite Motion, that changed, and the go-go became a higher error rate than the no offset and the linear. So the device change made a difference. In figure B, there was an interaction effect between the offset and the depth at 0.3 meters. The go-go is not different from the linear offset, but when you got to the second distance, then the error rate of the go-go became slightly higher. And let's see, we move on to graph E. This was interaction between device and depth. Again, this was significant interaction. At 0.5 meters, the Razer Hydra has a significantly lower error rate than the Elite Motion, but at 0.3 they did not differ significantly, so it sort of separated out as distance got larger. So what am I doing for time? All right, I'm going to abbreviate some of this. So when we got to the out of reach conditions, we get much higher error rates. They started going up to like 50% in the worst case, 30 and 35. The results were significant. Linear offset was lower than the fixed offset. The Razer Hydra was better than the Elite Motion. There was about 30% errors versus 45, which is getting pretty large. Now I'm skipping down a little bit here for time. In D, the interaction for offset and depth was also significant. Linear offset was more accurate than fixed at the shorter depth, while they stopped being different at the longer depth. So you can sort of see that visually in the graph. All right, effective throughput. So within reach, no offset had a higher throughput. So these ranges range from about 0.5 to 3. Then the go-go and the linear offset. In terms of devices, the Razer Hydra provided a higher effective throughput than the Elite Motion. That was about 2.06 versus 1.63. There are a lot of interaction effects. In A, and for the Hydra, the go-go and the Elite Motion did not differ, but when you switch to the Elite Motion, the linear offset had a higher throughput than the go-go. So again, these device differences are fairly consistent across the measurements. In B, interaction between offset and depth was again significant. At the shorter distances, go-go provided higher throughput than the linear offset, but that sort of reversed. At the 0.5 meter distance, the linear offset was higher throughput than the go-go. So things sort of swapped around a little bit. And let's see, for time, I'm just going to skip down to, let's say, E, or D. Let's do D. All right, offset and depth interactions were significant. At the 1.2 meters, fixed and go-go were not significantly different, so they're fairly close together. But when you move further out, then they become significantly different. So one thing to say is that this effective throughput measure originally was designed with error rates around 20%. So in our conditions where we had reasonable error rates, that's fairly reasonable to interpret. But in the cases where we had these much higher error rates, it's not quite clear how to interpret some of these BPS calculations. All right, brief discussion. So our first hypothesis was confirmed. The no offset technique outperformed the go-go and the linear offset when you were in the shorter range distance. And then the second hypothesis was also confirmed when you had the out of reach distances. The linear offset provided better performance than the fixed or the go-go technique. And then in general, the Razer Hydra outperformed the Elite Motion at all the depths and for pretty much all the measurements. Let's see, so I'll skip some of these items for time. So one thing to point out is although we had very high error rates overall, if we compared our results to some other more recent work that had a similar type of study, the error rates were 8% and an average throughput of about 1.98%. If we stick with our best case scenario, which was the Hydra with no offset within reach, then we actually, in that case, were reasonably within range in terms of error and throughput. So essentially, once we added in all the offset techniques and the Elite Motion, that's when things started getting much higher error rates. All right, so to conclude, no offset is more efficient when the target object is in reach. Out of reach, the linear offset performed better than the other two extended reach techniques. And in general, okay, the Razer Hydra seemed to perform better. And of course, this is in part due to the particulars of the Elite Motion, that's field of view, its resolution. You might get better results with 100 cameras instead of one. But it basically just points out empirically that the robustness of the pinch gesture has a significant effect on the overall results compared to just pressing the button, which usually doesn't fail. Future work, basically one of the reasons why we kept the short range distance is because we've been experimenting with traveling in 7 degrees of freedom where you're changing the scale. And so our question is, if you can change the scale of your user's environment as a whole, and you also have extended reach, do you need extended reach to go as far as it would otherwise if you didn't have a multi-scale, dynamically scaled environment? Other than that, I'll take questions.
When did GoGo's acceleration kick in? Did it kick in for the short offsets? Because that seems like real important thing to
That's a very important question, and I'm trying to remember what the kick-in point was. This graph is not to scale. I'd have to double check the paper to tell you. Sorry. I'll look it up and tell you.
Okay. Other questions?
Maybe this is to the both of you. I've seen Fitts law kind of studies that where the next target appears essentially randomly as soon as you picked one, and I've seen others where, like in this case, where you knew where you had to go, so you could basically plan your entire motion path ahead of time.
Correct.
Can you talk about like which one is better?
Oh boy. Well, I'm not sure which one is better. We went with the ISO standard because it seemed like it had a lot of experience behind it and had made it easier to compare it to other results.
I'll just add a bit. If you have random targets, you cannot pre-plan your motion. So you have the problem of you basically have to first recognize the target, so that adds a potential overhead, right? Especially if it's potentially even in the periphery or completely out of the field of view, then you can clearly see that it's not going to work. Right? So with the ISO standard, you know what the motion is going to be. All that remains is to execute it, right? And so that is closer to a scenario where you have an expert user who knows where the target is going to be, roughly speaking, and just executes the motion, right? And so that's a best case scenario for pointing, right? To basically really evaluate, take all the human elements out of it. How fast can you really do? I mean, sorry, perceptual experiment, yes, just the motion, motor performance, right? Rapid aimed movements, right?
So to answer the first question, the threshold was 1/2 of the user's measured arm length in their experiment. So there's a little bit of variability from person to person.
Does that answer the question, or do you have more? Do you have a follow-up there?
So it did kick in slightly even for the shortest distances?
Yeah, if you assume that your half is beyond 30, it could kick in. That actually would depend a little bit on people's arm length. That's a good question.
I'm curious about the Leap versus the Razer. Did you get a sense of whether it's the detection of the pinch gesture or the execution of the pinch gesture? Do you know if anyone's used mocap on the fingers to figure out if it's easier to hold a tool than it is to try to do things with your hands in free space?
So I know there have been studies that compared a held device versus finger tracking that use the Vicon tracking with retroreflective markers, which is better than using different tracking systems. And my recollection from those experiments was it depended what you were measuring as to which of the two performed better. I think that was an experiment with I think they were simulating a car when you were manipulating items in a car. And I think users preferred the finger tracking, but I think there may have actually been a slight precision advantage to the device, but that's pulling from memory.
I also want to add, I mean, this is just in relation to the previous talk. Some of the older adults had actually trouble with the pinch gesture. Right. So that's also an interesting thing.
I wondered if it was a motor control problem or a detection problem.
Well, okay, sorry. I think the simple answer just seems to be just detection. And we played around with driver settings, and whatever we did, the average person, when we gave it to them, still was having more. And we didn't. If we had filmed them with a real camera, we could have gone back and figured out precisely how many times it seemed like they were missing, but we don't have that.
Just looking at, sorry, because I was looking very carefully at the video in the previous talk. Is the previous author here still? Yes, sorry, didn't see. It looked like one of the participants was actually doing it more like this than actually like this. So that seemed to have been in the oldest participant and a motor control problem. Yeah, so they're just not able to do it as well. Okay, fair enough. Sorry, Rob. Sure. You're cutting into your own time here.
I was going to say that. Quick question about the error rates versus throughput at the end. Do you have any idea what sort of error magnitudes you were seeing? So, I mean, how far off from the target center they were? Was it way off, or was it pretty close?
I don't think it was way off.
Okay,
because there were some comments in particular where people said it was harder for the farther distances because the physical size is the same, but the visual angle is smaller.
Right.
And so I don't think the actual magnitudes were that far off.
Okay. Yeah, I only ask because it's not quite accurate to compare throughput based on error rate, because it's not the percentage of targets you've missed that influences the standard deviation of the selection coordinates. It's how far off from the center they were, right? But
Right.
usually these
Okay.
things are correlated, right? So
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
But that's all I'm wondering.
Okay.
We actually saw this happen in a study we did for 3DUI last 2017, the last 3DUI.
Okay.
Where we were using ray casting, and we found that by looking at the selection coordinate on the hull of the target, that actually artificially biased throughput down, because you couldn't be any more accurate than selecting on the surface of the target. So we ended up
Okay.
using the selection coordinate as the closest point on the ray to the target center for that reason, because then you could actually do better and have a higher throughput, or what we thought at the time was a more plausible throughput. But anyway, this is the only reason I asked.
Interesting, okay.
All right, let's thank Zach again.